Sometimes the threat of violence is as powerful as the act itself. Violence is not an accident. It is not a lapse, nor is it a slip. It is the logical extension of supremacy. Now, for the sake of clarity, let me be abundantly clear. Women do not need saving. Not now, not ever. Women do not need a man to carry them. Hello and welcome to another thrilling episode and conversation on Blood and Scars podcast. I am your host, Jonathan Banks. Thank you for joining me today. So before we begin, I want to quickly ask, why does male power slip into violence many of the times? So before we dive into the main conversation for today, I have an email that I want to share with you guys. A listener has sent me this weeks before now, and I decided to share it on here. The listener says, I have listened to your episodes, and for the first time, I feel like someone might understand. I need to tell you what I have lived through. I have lived with fear my whole life. My father used to hit me, and my mother. First, fists, belts, even objects thrown to my mother with no warning. I learned to hide under beds, behind doors, counting every second until the screaming stopped. I learned that love smelled like bruises and smelled like smoke from anger. Then I married. I thought it would be different. It wasn't. He isolates me from everyone, watches me eat, sleeps, and then even breathe. He has slammed my head against walls, shoved me downstairs, thrown things at me so close I can still feel the air slice past my skin. I have bruises. I have tried to hide marks that burn when I touch them. Sometimes he smiles afterward like nothing happened. And that's the worst part. I spent my days editing myself, shrinking, whispering, trying not to make a sound that might make him angry again. And some nights I wake with his hands on my throat in my dreams, and I can't tell if I am safe anymore. From a listener. You see, these things are very, very, very sad to see or to read and to even hear. Now, if power were solid, if power were secure, it would not need to shout. It would not need to strike. It would not need to bruise. But then supremacy, male supremacy in particular, is not solid. It is very, very fragile. And fragility, honestly, when dressed up as authority, it demands constant performance. Absolute constant performance. Now, let's think of it this way. Real power is like an empire built on stone, enduring, quite expansive, confident in its foundation. Male supremacy, however, is more like a crumbling empire, propped up with propaganda and fear. And then every act of equality is an uprising, and every question a rebellion. And when an empire knows it cannot last, it reaches for violence as its final weapon. Now, you begin to ask yourself, what must the man do? Of course, he has to perform. The man has to perform. He must constantly try to prove himself. He must prove at all times that he's in control. He must prove that he is feared and he is to be feared. He must also prove that he cannot be challenged. He must also prove to the society And 90% of the time, the inhabitants of that society are women who he must subdue at all costs, who he must show that supremacy, who he must show that authority, who he must show that wholeness of being as the man, in quotes. And you dare not challenge that kind of a man. And yet, none of these things can ever be permanently proven. Control must be renewed daily. It becomes a ritual, and fear must be enforced repeatedly at all times. And then his unchallengeable status must not be defended in every argument, every dinner table, and then in every bedroom, and then even every boardroom. And so he reaches for the tools at his disposal. He reaches for the tools at his hand. His voice rises above reason. And then his hand clenched into something more persuasive than words. His body postured and positioned as a weapon. You see, violence is not an accident. It is not, as we often hear, a moment of anger. It is not a lapse, nor is it a slip. It is the logical extension of supremacy. It is the logical extension of supremacy that cannot tolerate equality of any form. And women, sadly so, are in that position. So let us try to go deeper. Let us try to see what happens in the psyche of the man who embraces supremacy. First, there is a type of conditioning. From childhood, boys are always taught that their worth rests not in their tenderness, not in wisdom even, not in creativity, but in dominance. Men are given little crowns, just small enough to fit their small head, all right, or to fit their big head, as the case may be. They call them man of the house, protector of women, leader of the future. And somehow, these words, they sound so flattering, but they are cages. They whisper to the boys, you must always be higher. You must never be beneath. And how about the girls? How about the young woman? How about that young girl who craves for education so much, who craves to be a fighter so much, who craves to be a warrior so much so that she can even give her all just to attain that position? But somehow the society tries to subdue them. And with what tool exactly? The man. Now, for the sake of clarity, let me be abundantly clear. Women do not need saving. Not now, not ever. Women do not need a man to carry them. Women do not need men to approve them. Women do not need men to validate their worth. They do not need shields. They do not need armor. They do not need saving. They do not need permissions or permission slips to claim their space. What women need, and what we must teach our women, what we must teach our young girls growing up, what we must teach them loudly and without compromise, without fear, is this: your strength is yours. Your voice is sovereign. Your voice is supreme. Your mind, your body, your soul, these are not secondary. And they also do not require authorization from someone else. They do not need authorization from a man They do not need authorization from another woman. What we must teach them is that they are inherent, unassailable, and absolute. And that is the only way we can inculcate these things early enough on our girls. We must teach them from a very young age that their voice are powerful, that they are sufficient, however it may seem. Now, if you are every woman or every woman listening to me right now or listening to this episode right now, and you must hear this and hold it to your chest, you are not incomplete. You are not unfinished. You are not a project for someone else to fix. Your existence is full. Your power is already whole. And anyone who tells you otherwise, I promise you, hasn't seen you. Anybody who tells you otherwise has not seen your full potential. And then what happens when life, unpredictable, unruly, uncontrollable life, dares to place him beside the woman or even beneath her? Now I'm talking about the man. What happens when the woman earns more than the man? What happens when the woman speaks louder than the man in a boardroom? What happens when she commands that respect that he cannot command? What happens if she pays the bills? What happens if she tries or dares to pay the rent? What happens if she dares to pay the children's school fees? What happens if she dares to buy a luxury handbag for herself? And what happens if she tries to take herself on a vacation? What happens if she tells the man no? Or what happens if she tells the man, can we not do this today? This is what I want. I mean, she's human, right? What happens if she tells the man those things? The cage rattles. The fragility begins to shake. And rather than expand into a new vision of shared humanity, he begins to collapse into the only performance he has been trained for. He begins to collapse into the performance. He begins to shape shift into the performance he has been grown for, which is domination. Now, this is why so many men are threatened, not by hostility, but by equality. Right. You see, equality is the mirror that exposes supremacy as performance, as costume, as a myth. And myth can be defended with fragile egos, which quickly resort to force. The only thing that comes to the man's mind at this point is how to exert force, is how to exert absolute power, is how to exert absolute supremacy, is how to lord over the woman. You see, so violence then becomes the theater of supremacy. It is the scene in which the fragile actor reasserts his role. Now you will think of the raised voice. It is an attempt to rewrite the script. You think of the slammed door. It is an attempt to punctuate the dialogue with fear. And you also think of the fist. That is the final proof. Because when words and presence no longer sustain the illusion, you resort to fists. But what makes the psychology even more insidious is this, okay? Violence does not need to be constant, to be effective. Just a single blow, a single outburst, a single episode of terror can cast a shadow long enough to discipline a woman for years, as long as it's going to take. Supremacy does not always seek constant eruption. So what supremacy does is that it seeks a lasting control. because they want to reign supreme, right? They want to be the absolute power. And sometimes the threat of violence is as powerful as the act itself. I'll repeat that again. Sometimes the threat of violence is as powerful as the act itself. And for those who are struggling, for those women who are struggling with their mental health, the threat of violence can even be worse, much more, than the act itself. And this is why many women tell you, he only hit me once, but that one time rewrote the boundaries of her entire existence. That one time the man hit the woman rewrote the boundaries of her entire being. It shifted slowly how she walked, how she spoke, how she even ate, how she calculated every interaction, how she communicated with friends, how she communicated with her own immediate family. Okay? Violence is not physical. It's not only physical, I mean. Violence is very, very psychological. It is anticipatory. Okay? Because you know what happens? Supremacy thrives on the fear that violence could erupt at any point in time. So sometimes the man might not directly be hitting the woman, okay? But because the woman has been psychologically built to imagine that the man is going to hit her at a particular time, or that the man might hit her at a particular time, the fear that grips her psychologically is even worse than the act itself. So I want us to step back. Let's recollect and think. Why does fragility disguise itself as strength many of the times? Because in truth, men have been taught to build their power on the erosion of others, right? Men have been taught to build their power on the erosion of others, not on the cultivation of self per se. Okay? Because true power is quiet. It does not need validation. But you see, supremacy is performative. It cannot survive without an audience. Supremacy cannot thrive without an audience. It is always asking, did you see me win? Or did you see me dominate? Did you see me silence her? And when no audience applauds this violence, when no audience applauds this man, violence becomes the loudest ovation. And it says, I am still in charge. That is the man talking. I will not be forgotten. That is also the man talking. Even if you despise me, you would not ignore me. That is the man talking. And this is why male supremacy so often collapses into brutality. It is addicted to recognition. And when recognition does not come freely, it seizes it by force. It takes it by force. And that is when the act of abuse comes in. That is when the act of actual violence comes in. Why all these are true, I want us to consider the cultural scaffolding that props this psychology. I want us to consider the cultural roots that props this whole psychology of dominance. Religious texts, too, often misinterpreted, declare men as heads and women as servants. I know that's going to be debatable, but that's the truth. We have legal codes, historically, who treated wives as properties. The cultural proverbs rewards male aggression. A man must rule his house. A man must be feared constantly. And so the man who lifts his hand is not always condemned. Okay? Sometimes he is excused. Sometimes he's even justified. And sometimes the man is even celebrated as one who keeps his house in order, as one who keeps his house in check. Now, this is the most chilling part of psychology of dominance. It does not exist in isolation. It is not simply the failing of one violent man, okay? It is the architecture of a society that teaches him, that also rewards him, but silences her. Thus, violence is not simply personal. Violence is political. Violence is systematic. Now let's imagine a woman sitting at the dining table. The woman voices her opinion. Her husband becomes unsettled, and then he snaps. Be quiet. That is not yet violence. That is supremacy speaking. And if the woman persists, and the man slams his fist against the wood, against the table, that is not yet blood. But that is violence knocking on the door. And then again, the woman protests further. And the hand that had once caressed her strikes her instead on the cheek that he once kissed. So do you see the psychology of dominance is like a staircase. It just goes. Each step feels small. Each escalation feels justifiable to him. But at the bottom of the staircase lies brutality. At the core of all this lies severe brutality. And once descended, too many men do not try to climb back up. Now, bear in mind, I had said too many men, not all men. When half of these men exert force, exert this supremacy, start exerting this violence nature on women, on your wives, it becomes like a hard drug. It becomes like an addiction. They don't go back to the way they were. It just keeps getting worse and worse and worse and worse. Because supremacy cannot tolerate equality. Supremacy cannot just tolerate equality, because equality dismantles the illusion of it. And when a woman says, I am not beneath you, the supremacist man hears, I am nothing without dominance. When a woman says, I have my own voice, what the man hears is this: my authority is hollow. And when a woman says, I cannot be silenced, the throne of glass has shattered. Right, the throne of glass has shattered. And so the man picks up a stone and then he goes into war. So you see, the psychology of dominance is not about strength, really. It is about fear. It's about fear of irrelevance, fear of exposure, fear that if women stand, men will finally have to sit beside them and not above them. That is the psychology of dominance. But here lies the secret. The throne of glass never had to exist in the first place. because true power was never hierarchical. Okay? True authority was never enforced with a fist. The psychology of dominance is a tragedy, and honestly so, because it imprisons both the women and the men in a cycle where violence masquerades as strength and fear parades as leadership. I want you all to understand that violence is not random. Violence is not a mistake. Violence is the language of supremacy. The final dialect spoken when reason has fled. So the next time someone says he just lost his temper, let us quickly answer, no, he hasn't lost his temper, or he did not lose his temper. He rehearsed supremacy his whole life. Let us tell him, no, he learned early that power must be proven. And that no, he did not lose control. He performed it. Because when equality walks into the room, supremacy does not bow. It picks up a stone, as always. Let's also quickly talk about the educational institution. Let's quickly talk about what the educational institution did. Because of course, half of the times I would like to say they did more harm than good in terms of equality or the psychology of dominance, right? So it has historically upheld the hierarchy. Boys are usually encouraged to explore, to be innovative, to assert themselves. And girls are often taught humility and conformity. And so you see, even today, there's a subtle difference. The subtle difference remains. Who gets called on in the classroom, who is praised for assertiveness or the most assertiveness, who is taught ambition, who is taught that ambition is audacious and then even dangerous. Let's also quickly consider what the language does. Let's also consider what the language do. It says a boy is strong-willed, a girl is bossy, and a man assertive. A woman is too aggressive. And you discover that the words we choose reinforce who is meant to lead and who is meant to follow. Violence is the only final stage of this conditioning, the apex of the structure already built around the notion that men have the right to control. So you would understand that culture and custom are no less potent. Let's think of this saying: a man must rule his household. A woman's place is in the home. Okay? Children are fathered by men, guided by women. So you notice the implicit structure. The man is the ruler, always the ruler. The woman is the subordinate. The child is trained to observe, learn, and continue the cycle. Custom cements violence too. Okay, a boy who hits a girl in adolescence may be laughed at and not corrected. A husband who disciplines his wife harshly may be excused or even admired. Okay, and every culture has narrative that protects supremacy. And the architecture of dominance spreads across time, generations, and even geography. But the architecture of supremacy is not solely external. It is internalized, I think. And rightly so. The mind of the man absorbs permission somehow to dominate from the moment he can walk and speak. How about we teach our girl child that as well? The man is rewarded for aggression, affirmed for control, excused for coercion. Supremacy becomes instinct, and violence becomes a tool he reaches for reflexibility. I'm not sure if that word is correct. For reflexively, yes? And it's so sad to see. It's so sad to see young women being taught always that silence or conformity is a virtue. And you see, the internalization is reinforced by observation. Fathers dominating mothers, uncles, brothers, coaches, pastors, elders, all performing the same roles. The boy who imitates what he has seen, and the girl who learns to anticipate it. This is how the architecture becomes psychology. So the external scaffolding enters the body and mind, shaping perception, thought, and action. So violence is not a lapse in judgment. Okay? It becomes land. It becomes a rehearsed response. Violence becomes a rehearsed response. Because of course you must exude something, right? And that thing which you must exude is violence. So as we step away from this act, understand this. Male supremacy is more than brute force. It is an entire architecture of culture. It's an entire architecture of law. It's an entire architecture of education, of language, of ritual, designed to sustain itself across generation. I tell you again, violence is not random. Violence is not incidental. It is just the apex, the enforcement, the mechanism, the punctuation marks at the top of a tower, built to control, built to dominate, and built to erase. But you see, architecture, no matter what, no matter how grand it is not eternal. It can be disconstructed. It can be dismantled. It can be unlearned. And the first step to see it is to name it. The first step to see what violence is to name it, is to see it for what it truly is, violence, and then call it by name. Because only then, I believe, can we start dismantling this architecture of male dominance. Only then can we start embodying it bit by bit. Because I tell you what, culture can be unlearned and relearned. Okay? So when I hear people tell you this is how they are, I tell them no. You know why? Because they have not, in all honesty, acknowledged the facts of their wrongdoing. They've not honestly and then intentionally as well acknowledges the fact that they have been taught wrongly. And for you to acknowledge that you've been taught wrongly, you must hold the tutors responsible. You must challenge their teachings. And this is just one of the ways we challenge their teachings. Because I grew up in a society where women are defenseless. Half of the times, women should be at the background making babies, fanning the embers of the man. I understand that times are changing. I understand that culture is shifting, which I'm happy for, by the way. But I think as a people, we need to do more. We need to do more, because our kids are growing. They are seeing these things. So we have a responsibility as parents, as tutors, as guardians, to imbibe this culture, to imbibe these teachings to our children at a very tender age. Else they grow amiss. So if you're that woman listening to me right now, I want you to understand this for a fact, that you are enough. I want you to understand that you are self-sufficient. I want you to understand that you do not need a man's validation to survive. You do not need a man's validation to live. You do not need a man's validation to be whole. You do not need a man's validation to be in that boardroom. You do not need a man's validation to take up that new role. And I hope this episode resonates with you. And then if it does, I want you to please share to all social media platforms and follow me on all my social media platforms. Until we meet again for our another thrilling episodes and conversations, please remain blessed. Once again, I am your host, Donald Banks. Thank you for joining me.